They told me I was putting myself before my own grandchildren. That's exactly what my son said, not with anger, not even with raised voice. Just a flat, matter-of-fact tone like he was reading a weather report. You're putting yourself before Emma and Tyler. I had just told him I couldn't take the children for 10 days while he and his wife went to Tuscany for their anniversary trip. I couldn't take them because I was scheduled for a total knee replacement on the second Tuesday of March, and my orthopedic surgeon had been very clear that I would not be walking unassisted for at least a week afterward. But apparently, that wasn't a good enough reason. I am 63 years old. I raised my son alone after his father left when Daniel was 4. I worked double shifts at a hospital billing office for 11 years so he could have the things I never had. I watched him graduate college, walk down the aisle, hold his firstborn daughter for the first time. I gave him everything I had, and then I gave more on top of that. And the one time I said I physically cannot do this, my body will not allow it, he looked at me like I had chosen a vacation over my family. The conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon in late February. I remember because I had just come back from my pre-surgical consultation. I was still wearing my coat when the phone rang. My son's voice was businesslike from the first word. "Mom, we need to talk about the Italy trip. Melissa and I have been planning this for 8 months. It's our 10th anniversary. We already have the flights, the hotels. Everything is non-refundable. We need someone for Emma and Tyler, and you're the only option." I told him about the surgery. I told him the date, the surgeon's name, the recovery timeline. I even offered to send him the discharge instructions so he could understand what the doctor expected of me. There was a pause on the other end. Then those words, flat as pavement. "You're putting yourself before Emma and Tyler." I asked him if he heard what I said, that I was having surgery. He said, "Yes. I heard you. Can't you push it back?" I had been waiting 14 months for this surgery. My knee had been bone on bone for 2 years. I walked with a cane on bad days. I had canceled Christmas plans and a trip to see my college roommate and 3 different social engagements because I couldn't stand for more than 20 minutes without pain radiating up into my hip. I had pushed it back twice already because of their schedule. But I didn't say any of that. I just said, I couldn't push it back again. He said he'd call me later. He didn't. What came instead was a text from Melissa. It arrived at 11:47 that night. "We've decided we need to take a break from the dynamic that's been forming. Please, don't stop by the house for a while. We'll reach out when we're ready." And then, 1 minute later, a second text. "We've added a new door code, just so you know." I read those messages standing in my kitchen in my pajamas, with a glass of water halfway to my mouth. I set the glass down very carefully. I read them again. A new door code. Just so you know. I had used that door code for 4 years. I knew it the same way I knew my own birthday. The same way I knew Emma's favorite color was yellow, and Tyler still slept with the stuffed elephant I gave him when he was born. They had changed the code like I was a contractor whose access had expired. I drove to their house the next morning. Not to argue. I don't know exactly why. Habit, maybe. Or some stubborn piece of me that needed to see it with my own eyes before I could believe it. The house was a tan brick colonial on the east side of Indianapolis. I had helped them pick it out. I had sat across from the real estate agent at that kitchen table and co-signed the mortgage application because Daniel's credit score wasn't where it needed to be, and Melissa had gaps in her employment history. I knew every room in that house. I had painted Emma's bedroom lavender when she was still an infant. I had assembled the crib, the dresser, the little bookshelf with the cloud cutouts. I rang the doorbell. Nothing. I knocked. Nothing. Through the side window, I could see Tyler's red boots lined up by the mat, toes pointing outward the way 3-year-olds leave things. I entered the code. The keypad flashed red once, then twice, then went still. A new door code. Just so you know. I stood on the porch for another minute, then walked back to my car. I sat there for a long time. The street was quiet. A neighbor was walking a dog 2 houses down. The dog stopped and looked at me. Then, they moved on. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the last decade. Not the emotional things, not the birthdays and the Christmases and the afternoons pushing Emma on the swings at the park. The practical things. The financial architecture I had built underneath their lives. The $22,400 I contributed to their wedding when Daniel said the venue they wanted was just slightly out of reach and they didn't want to compromise on it. The $14,000 I transferred to cover their down payment gap when the mortgage came up short. The $31,000 I spent over 4 years quietly paying down the private student loans Melissa had accumulated before their marriage, at her own request, because she said the monthly payment was crushing them and she had started having anxiety attacks. The monthly transfers to their grocery account, $600 a month for 3 years, which I had started because Melissa was on maternity leave, and Daniel said things were tight, and I said I could help, and somehow tight became permanent, and the transfers never stopped. I was not keeping score. I was never keeping score. But I was an insurance billing specialist for 30 years. And I recorded things by nature, and the records existed whether I wanted them to or not. I got up at 5 in the morning and made coffee and sat at my dining room table with a legal pad. I added the numbers once, then added them again. The total, not counting the groceries, not counting the co-signed mortgage, not counting the birthday checks, or the Christmas deposits, or the time I paid cash for a new refrigerator because theirs broke during a heat wave and they said they didn't have room on any card. The total was 8,100美元. I sat with that number for a long time. I wrote it out in full. $81,200. Then I wrote it again. Then I put my pen down and drank my coffee and watched the morning get lighter outside my kitchen window, and I thought, who takes care of me? I had my surgery scheduled for Tuesday. There was no one driving me to the hospital. My son had not offered. Melissa had not offered. My neighbor Janet had offered 6 weeks ago, and I had said I'd be fine. I didn't want to be a bother. And she had looked at me in that way she had and said, Beverly, stop that. Of course I'm taking you. Janet drove me on Tuesday morning at 6:15. She waited in the family waiting area for 4 hours. She was the one who held the discharge papers while I managed the crutches. She was the one who made sure I had water and a pillow under my leg on the drive home. She brought soup that evening and came back the next morning to help me shower because I couldn't balance on the knee alone yet. My son called on Thursday, 2 days after the surgery, and it was not to ask how I was doing. He said, "We noticed the grocery transfer didn't go through this month." I had not called the bank yet. I hadn't done anything yet. I was lying in my own bed with my leg elevated and a bag of frozen peas wrapped in a dish towel pressed against my knee, and my son was calling to ask about a bank transfer. I told him I had just had surgery 2 days ago. He said he knew that. He was just asking about the transfer. I said I'd look into it. He said okay. He hung up. After the call, I lay very still. The afternoon light was coming through the curtains the way it does in late winter, flat and pale and without warmth. I looked at the ceiling. I had raised this person. I had read to him every night until he was old enough to read himself. I had driven him to baseball practice and tutoring and a dozen summer camps. I had paid his college tuition on a billing specialist's salary by working evenings from home for 3 additional years. I had walked him down the aisle because there was no one else to do it, and I was proud to. I was genuinely proud, and he had cried. He had actually cried when we reached the end of that aisle, and I thought, this is everything. This is what all of it was for. And he called 2 days after my surgery to ask about a transfer. I reached for my phone and called my financial advisor. Then I called my bank. Then I pulled up the contact card I had saved 7 years ago and never deleted. Thomas Garrett, estate attorney. He had handled my mother's affairs and he had been kind about it. His receptionist answered, and I made an appointment for Friday morning. When I hung up, something in me went quiet. Not sad quiet, just clear. I went to Thomas Garrett's office on crutches. He had more gray in his hair, but the same reading glasses, the same organized desk. He listened to everything without writing anything down. When I finished, he said, "I'm sorry, Beverly. That kind of thing takes a long time to name, even when you're living it." I said yes. I think it does. We spent 2 hours working through documents. The power of attorney I had granted to Daniel 4 years ago, back when I'd had a health scare and felt like I should have someone designated, we revoked it. My will had listed Daniel as sole beneficiary with trusts for Emma and Tyler. I restructured it. My younger sister Carol in Phoenix, who called me every Sunday without fail, and had flown out to sit with me the morning of my husband's funeral 11 years ago, became primary beneficiary. Emma and Tyler each retained their trusts because they were children, and none of this was their doing. Daniel was removed entirely from the estate. I told Thomas about the co-signed mortgage. He said there was no clean way out of it short of them refinancing, but he could send formal notice to the lender that I was requesting removal, which would create a record and apply pressure. I told him to do it. He also drew up a personal loan agreement backdated to document the $81,200 as a formal loan rather than gifts, which I could choose to forgive in my estate or choose to call in. I wasn't sure yet which I would do, but I wanted the document to exist. When I left his office, the air outside was cold and the sidewalk was uneven, and I had to watch my footing on the crutches. But I stood at the top of the steps and breathed for a moment before going down. I felt like myself. I had not felt like myself in a very long time. The following week, I called the bank and canceled all recurring transfers to accounts in Daniel and Melissa's names. The representative asked if I was certain. I said I was. She said she would process it immediately. I thanked her. After I hung up, I made a cup of tea and sat on my back porch, even though it was only 40 degrees out, because I wanted the air. The yard was still winter brown and flat. A pair of sparrows were doing something complicated in the bare oak tree at the back fence line. I watched them for a while. On Wednesday evening, Daniel called. His voice was not flat this time. It had an edge in it, a tight, controlled kind of anger that I recognized from when he was a teenager, and I had told him no about something. "Mom, we got a notice from the mortgage lender, and the transfers still haven't come through." I told him the transfers were canceled, all of them, permanently, and that he should be receiving formal correspondence from an attorney regarding the mortgage. Silence. "Then what is this?" I said. "This is me adjusting things." He said, "Are you doing this because of the Italy trip?" I said, "I'm doing this because I drove myself to surgery, and your call 2 days later was about a bank transfer." He said that wasn't fair, he had been meaning to call. I said, "I know. That's exactly the problem." He said I was being vindictive. I said I was being honest. He said this wasn't who I was. I said perhaps he hadn't looked closely enough. He hung up. 20 minutes later, Melissa called. I let it go to voicemail. She said in a measured, careful voice that she understood. I was upset and that emotions were running high, but that she and Daniel wanted to work through this as a family, and that they hoped I would call back when I was ready to have a productive conversation. She said the children missed me. Her voice shifted slightly on that last sentence. The way a person's voice shifts when they're reading from a script, and suddenly the words mean something. She said Emma had been asking about me. She said, "She loves you, Beverly, and she doesn't understand what's happening." I saved the message and sat with it for a while. The call I wasn't expecting came on a Thursday in late March. Not from Daniel, not from Melissa, from Emma's school. The woman identified herself as the school counselor, and she said Emma was having a very hard morning. She said Emma had been coming to the counselor's office twice a week for the past month, that she had been withdrawn in class, and had started crying during lunch. She said that today Emma had become very distressed during a classroom activity about families and had asked to call her grandmother. She said Emma was insistent. She said she had tried Daniel and Melissa, and neither had answered. She asked, gently, if I could come. I was in the parking lot within 20 minutes, knee brace and all. Emma was sitting in the counselor's outer office, in a plastic chair 2 sizes too big for her backpack in her lap, her braids slightly undone on one side. She was 6 years old, and she looked exhausted. When she saw me come through the door, she stood up and walked to me with great seriousness and put her arms around my waist and held on. She didn't make a sound. She just held on. I am listed on the emergency contact form. I have been listed on that form since Emma started school. The counselor let me sign her out, and we walked to my car slowly because of my crutches, and Emma held the door open for me without being asked, and that small, careful gesture nearly undid me entirely. We drove without talking for a few minutes. Then Emma said, "Why don't you come over anymore?" I told her that her parents and I had some things to work through, and that it was nothing she did, and that I loved her very much. She thought about this. She said, "Daddy says you stopped paying for things." I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "I did stop, yes." She said, "Why?" I thought about how to answer that. I said, "When someone gives and gives for a long time, it's important that the people they're giving to notice and say thank you, and make sure that person is okay, because otherwise, the giving person can start to feel invisible, like they only matter when they're being useful." Emma was quiet. Then she said, "I notice you." I blinked hard. I said, "I know you do, sweetheart. That's one of my favorite things about you." She said, "And I say thank you." I said, "You always do." She said, "So, you'll still come to my things? My recital and stuff?" I said, "Absolutely every single one." I took her to my house. I made grilled cheese and apple slices and let her watch a movie on my laptop in bed next to me because my knee was still making stairs complicated. She fell asleep with one hand curled around my wrist. I watched her sleep for a while. My daughter-in-law called at 7:30. Her voice was careful again, but something was different in it this time. She said, "I don't want to fight." I said, "Neither do I." She said, "Can I come get her?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Can we talk?" I said, "Yes, but not tonight. Come tomorrow morning." Melissa arrived alone. Daniel had stayed home with Tyler. She sat across my kitchen table and she was not the person I had expected. She looked tired. Not the performed exhaustion of someone making a point, but genuinely worn down. She said, "Things have been difficult." I said I had heard that from Emma and I was sorry the children were experiencing that. She looked up. She said, "I know what we did was wrong. The code, the texts, telling you not to come by." She said she had been overwhelmed and she had let Daniel lead on it, and she shouldn't have. She said she had told him it went too far, after the fact. I asked her what happened after the fact. She said not much. She said that was part of the problem. I looked at her for a long moment. I had known Melissa for 9 years. I had stood at the altar and watched my son marry her, and I had thought she was him, steady where he was impulsive, organized where he was careless. I still thought those things might be true. I also thought that she had sent me a text at midnight, telling me my access to my grandchildren's home had been revoked, and she had done it without calling, without looking me in the eye, and I had not received an apology until the money stopped. I said, "I appreciate you saying that, and I mean it. But I need you to understand something. What happened wasn't just that my feelings got hurt. I came out of surgery and didn't hear from your household for 2 days, and the first call was about a bank transfer. That's not a miscommunication, that's a value system." She was quiet. I continued, "I'm not going away. Emma and Tyler are my grandchildren, and I will be at every recital and every birthday and every graduation until I physically cannot be anymore. But I won't be the account your family draws from whenever it's convenient. I won't be the emergency option who's disposable when the emergency is mine." She had tears on her face. She didn't wipe them right away. She said, "I don't know how to fix this." I said, "I'm not sure fix is the right word. I think the word is build. Something different. On different terms." She asked what that looked like. I said I wasn't entirely sure yet, but it started with her and Daniel understanding that I am a person with a body and limits and needs and feelings, not a function they subscribe to. She nodded slowly. She said, "Daniel is going to be harder." I said, "I know. I'll deal with Daniel separately." My son called 2 days later. He did not lead with an apology. He said he had been thinking and he wanted to understand my perspective. I said I appreciated that. He said he thought he had dropped the ball with the surgery and that he was sorry about that specifically. I said thank you. There was a pause. He said, "Mom, $80,000. His voice had something in it I hadn't heard in a while. Not anger. Something closer to shock. He said, "I didn't know it was that much." I said, "I know you didn't. I didn't tell you because it didn't feel like something I should have to say." He said, "But that's your retirement." I said, "Yes, a portion of it, yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't ask you for all of that." I said, "No, you didn't. You asked me for pieces of it over many years, and I said yes every time because I loved you and I had it to give. I'm not resentful about the giving. I'm resentful about what happened when I couldn't give." Do you understand the difference? He said he thought he did. I said I hoped so. He said, "Is it too late?" I said, "It depends on what you're asking." He said, "For us to be okay. For me to actually show up." I said it wasn't too late. But I said I needed him to understand that okay was going to look different from now on, that I would not be resuming monthly transfers, that I would not be co-signing anything further, that I would be present and loving, and a grandmother who showed up, but I was not a financial instrument, and I was not available to be removed from my grandchildren's lives every time I said no to something. He said, "That's fair." I said, "I know it is." Carol flew in from Phoenix 3 weeks later, partly to see me and partly because she had never been to Indianapolis in spring and wanted to. She slept in the guest room, and we stayed up too late, 2 nights in a row, talking the way we only could in person. The second night she said, "You know what Mom would say about all this?" I said, "Probably something useful that I didn't hear correctly at the time." She laughed. She said, "She would say you can love someone and still require them to treat you correctly. Those aren't opposites." I said I was learning that. She said, "You're not learning it. You always knew it. You just kept making exceptions." I said yes. I think that's right. I went to Emma's spring recital on a Thursday evening. She was a butterfly in a yellow leotard with pipe cleaner antennae that she had made herself. She spotted me in the third row before the music started, and her entire face changed. She pointed at me. I waved. The woman next to me smiled and said, "Granddaughter?" I said yes. She said, "You can always tell." She said, "The way kids' faces do that when they see the person they trust most." I thought about that on the drive home. The person they trust most. I had been so focused on what was being taken from me that I had momentarily lost sight of what was still there. Emma's antennae, crooked and proud. Tyler running to the car window when he saw me pull up. The specific way a child reaches for you when you are the person they trust most in a room. Daniel was at the recital. We sat with Melissa and Tyler in the row behind me, and he sat next to me for the second act, and at some point he put his hand briefly on my arm, in that way people do when words feel too small. I didn't make anything of it. I just let it be there. It was a beginning, not an ending. I was not sure what it would grow into. I was not prepared to promise it would grow into anything specific, but I was willing to find out on my own terms, in my own time, with my own door code that I alone controlled. My knee was still healing. I still used a cane on cold mornings. I had signed up for a watercolor class at the community center because Janet had been going for years and kept saying I would love it, and she was right. I did love it, even though my trees looked like green clouds and my sky kept going gray when I wanted blue. There were 8 women in the class, and we laughed at our own work freely, and that laughing felt like something I had set down years ago and just recently picked back up. On the last Thursday of April, I got a card in the mail. Emma's handwriting, round and careful, with a drawing of 2 people I recognized as us, because one of them was on crutches and the other had pipe cleaner antennae drawn in. Inside she had written, "To Grandma Beverly, I am glad you came to my recital. You are my favorite. Love, Emma. I put it on the refrigerator. I stood in front of it for a while. Then I put on my coat and went out to the garden because the bulbs I had planted in February were starting to come up through the soil, and I wanted to see what was going to bloom. I didn't know exactly what the next chapter looked like. I didn't know how much would be rebuilt or what shape it would take, but I knew that I had stopped disappearing into other people's needs. I knew that when my body told me to stop, I listened now. I knew that the $81,200 I gave away did not define my worth, and the fact that I stopped giving it did not make me cruel. I knew that love and self-erasure are not the same thing, and that I had spent too many years confusing them. I was 63 years old, and my knee was healing, and my trees still looked like green clouds, and my granddaughter had called me her favorite. That was enough to stand on. That was more than enough to begin. If you've ever given everything you had and been made to feel selfish for finally saying no, I want you to know you are not selfish. You are a person who finally remembered that. Leave a comment below if this story stayed with you, and follow along for more stories that speak the things we've been too quiet about for too long.